Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of some young adult fantasy and then one science fiction book that I think are great if you typically read adult fantasy but you're wanting to maybe throw in the occasional YA book. I do have a companion video to this where it's the opposite. It's adult science fiction fantasy for young adult readers or for fantasy beginners, so I'll have that link down below if you're interested. One little tip, if you are somebody who typically doesn't dive into young adult books but you're wanting to here and there, I, with all but one of these, am going to let you know about the audiobook narrators as well, because I don't quite know why, I don't know what the marketing strategy is with this, but sometimes the narration for YA books, I almost feel like it ups the angstiness even when there isn't some. And I think that can actually cause older readers to feel frustrated and feel like it's too youthful in tone. But there are the occasional ones that have fantastic narrators. And I think that's very true of the first recommendation, which would be Strange the Dreamer and its sequel, Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. The narrator for these is phenomenal. He has a fantastic voice. I have a whole video about some of my favorite narrators, and he is on that list. He's fantastic. He's great. But these books have some really extreme themes, very heavy. There's kind of the trauma of an entire peoples in this book. It's very dark, but it's told in a very whimsical, beautiful way. The writing style is stunning. The setup is we follow our main character, Laszlo Strange, who's always been fascinated with this place that everybody knows as Weep. He believes this place is real, whereas most people think it is not. He's obsessed with it. He has learned everything there is to know about it, and then he has an opportunity to discover if it is real. And then you have another point of view that pops up, and this particular character, you don't really know how they relate to the other character. This other character is blue, and you don't know why, and the other people they're around are also blue. They have magical abilities. You don't know what's going on. It feels very much like a grim fairy tale. The next book recommendation would be The Thief, and currently the audiobook narration is done by the exact same audiobook narrator, so you are safe. I would say to check out these audiobooks as well, but this one follows a main character who's quite young, and I would say that if the character wasn't so young, it kind of has the potential to be adult fantasy. Its writing style reminds me quite a lot of Robin Hobbs from Assassin's Apprentice. There's something about it that feels sort of formal, and it's beautiful but also sort of dry at the same time. But this one, what really stood out to me was our main character definitely has a strong voice. They're young, they're a little sassy, they're a little over the top at times, they're a little eccentric, but the setup is that they are a thief and they have been hired, though not really of their own choosing, to acquire something on behalf of a royal individual. And it's not the most exciting of books. It is a traveling story, but it doesn't even really have the elements that a lot of traveling stories have, which is getting attacked by something along the way, or there's a mysterious thing going on in this one town. It doesn't really have any of that. It's kind of like, no, we're going over here and we're going to talk along the way. But strangely, that feels reminiscent of quest fantasy from a lot of adult fantasy works, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I think the tone is a little more mature despite having a somewhat immature protagonist, but they're pretty darn entertaining. I liked all of the lore elements that are tied into the book. Is the religion true, or is this just what people believe? I like the way that the author did all of that. I like the way they sprinkled in the economy and the politics. It was very subtle. Really, really liked it. Next up, we have Crown of Feathers by Nikki Powell-Preto. This is one that I would say the audiobook narration is a little on the younger sound. So if you're not wanting the angstiness to be leveled up, I would say maybe read this one physically, but it follows a group of rebellious Phoenix riders who are trying to gain something back. The phoenixes, the animal companion element to this mythological creature, I love so much. This one I would say definitely feels young adult. Our main character has a very difficult, high tension relationship with their sister. There are some interesting twists and turns along the way, but that character is somewhat naive and sweet, and they're just a good person. So the feel of it definitely is on the younger side because the character is younger. However, the history side of things, the lore in the book, it is probably the heaviest I've seen in most young adult fantasy. If you like learning about the history of things, if you like that there's folklore and there's old stories that the characters are really attached to, that they've heard for years and years and years, it's kind of ingrained in their brains. If you like that kind of stuff in your books, this one has it, so much of it. It's done really well. Next up, we have Woven in Moonlight. This is unfortunately the only one that I haven't sampled the audiobook of, so I can't give you any insight as to what that's like. But the book itself, once again, there are definitely some elements to this that make it young adult. And to be clear, there is nothing wrong with something feeling young adult. I just know that if you tend to read adult, it's probably because you don't always love the more youthful elements of young adult books. This one, though, is just, it's a lot of, there's a character spying on behalf of their people who, after a rebellion, have been removed from their homes. They're kind of starving. They don't have much left, and so they're very desperate at this point. Our main character makes some very cutthroat decisions that I was not expecting, especially out of a young adult book. Usually your main characters are not that cutthroat, but they were, and they end up spying on behalf of their people by starting to go to the enemies, and the enemies want to marry the royal figure to kind of ease tensions and essentially take over the former individuals. They are definitely causing issues within the city. So there's a lot of little intricacies that I feel like even me describing the book have clearly laid out. Our main character, Zemina, though, is not the royal figure. They have been a decoy for their Condessa. And so them going on behalf of their Condessa, they are going as a spy, and they are learning a lot of information. And there's a lot more to the enemy's side than they originally anticipated. I think it's a tad predictable, but I still feel like the level of detail that the author put into the story is really admirable, and I feel like it makes the setting come to life. It's also Bolivian inspired, and you can just, it just feels so different from a lot of your more European inspired fantasy. It stands out on its own. I think the way they describe food, color, clothes, the setting itself, there's so many elements to it that make it quite unique and incredibly well realized, which is why I think if you appreciate a well-realized setting in your adult fantasy, you'll like that about this one. Next up would be the science fiction book on the list, and that would be The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. The audiobook for this one is, I think, okay if you don't want the angstiness. It's done very well. This book is very unique, and I actually think it lends itself to being listened to quite well because our main character, first off, it's first-person narration, but Patrick Ness took advantage of that point of view. It's not your basic, I walked to the store and I collected the items I needed. It's not like that. The character, it really feels like their thoughts. It's somewhat scrambled. Our main character is very young, and they're in a society where it's all men. Something happened to all the women. All the men can hear each other's thoughts. It's known as noise, and that's the element of the story that works really well on audiobook because they do some special effects to have you hear the noise, which is really cool. Our main character also is not educated. They can't really read very well. That, you see it when you're reading, but when you're listening to it, the narrator definitely gives the character a certain voice. It just makes the character come to life. And I love the audiobook, but I also would read physically from time to time. You will have to get used to the way it's written because there's a lot of misspelled words to kind of enhance that feeling of the character not really knowing how to read or write. But there's so many twists and turns in this book. It has some very heavy themes. It's also really bizarre. It's essentially like following somebody who's trying to escape a cult. Last on the list, you guys knew I was going to recommend this. It'd be Fireborn by Rosaria Munda. The reason I'm recommending it is because it is heavy political fantasy. It is very well realized in that regard. I wouldn't say you get a lot of world building when it comes to the setting and those sorts of things. There's not really a magic system in this book. It feels very much like historical fiction, except for there are dragons, and it's not exactly our world, but it is Russian Revolution inspired. It's done so well. Our characters have to make some devastating choices. The thing that I think might not be to everybody's liking about the YA elements is just that I wouldn't even describe it as angstiness. The characters just have a lot of trauma in their life, and weirdly, their best friend sort of represents the trauma in their life. And so even though they're best friends, they also have a hard time even talking to the other person because it reminds them of some difficult things they've gone through. And it's a lot of like, oh, I miss when we were best friends. But also, they killed my family. Like, not them literally, but their family killed their family. That sort of, you know, basic best friend issues. But I actually feel like the way that the teenagers behave in this, it's not stupid. It just feels like how young individuals would think and act because they're young and they don't have a ton of experiences and they're trying to figure out themselves in the middle of a horrifying situation. And I will say, I wouldn't necessarily listen to the audiobook for this one. Not that it's bad. None of the narrators are bad by any means, but this one I would say would up that angsty feeling. I don't actually think this book has angst in the typical, like, I love this boy, he's such a bad boy. It doesn't have that kind of thing, but it definitely has, like I said, a lot of the characters thinking about each other. But I just think that this book is so good. Like I said, they have to make some heartbreaking decisions. I love examining trauma in books. I think the author does it so well. So, highly recommend. I do want to give an honorable mention. This one is neither fantasy or sci-fi, but I still feel like it's worth mentioning, and that would be Scythe by Neil Shusterman. This one, it's pretty popular. You've probably heard the premise by now. It follows a futuristic society where everything has been dealt with: war, disease, anything that can essentially cause death, except the threat of overpopulation. And we rely on, essentially the cloud has become sentient and it takes care of everybody. But they, in order to deal with overpopulation, mankind has decided that there will be individuals who can kill people, and when those people die, they don't get to come back. They aren't healed through the abilities that we now have with medicine. So it's really morbid, has a lot of questions about what it means to be alive, and it's very easy to get into. I also think Neil Shusterman has a little bit of a morbid sense of humor, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but it's very easy to get into. Like I said, I think it's fantastic, but it's not fantasy or sci-fi. Still worth mentioning though. If you have any of your own recommendations, please feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. Like I said, I'll have the other video linked. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.